Somewhere in the backwoods of Texas, a farmer wakes up to find his cornfield torn apart overnight. The soil flipped over like a plow had gone through it at random. It wasn't a plow. It was a sounder of wild pigs, moving through under cover of darkness, rooting for grubs and roots and anything edible they could dig up. Multiply that single field by millions of acres across dozens of states, and you start to understand the scale of a problem that has been quietly spiraling for decades. There are now more than 6 million feral hogs roaming the United States, and that number keeps climbing no matter how aggressively wildlife agencies try to knock it down. And yet, despite all that meat running around on four legs, almost none of it ends up on a dinner plate. That contradiction sits at the heart of one of the stranger food puzzles in modern America. The animals themselves are not native. Domestic pigs arrived with early European settlers, and over the following centuries some escaped or were deliberately released, adapting to life outside the barnyard. Later, in the 20th century, Eurasian wild boars were imported for sport hunting and interbred with these already feral populations, producing the hardy, intelligent, fast-breeding hybrid that dominates the landscape today. These animals are not picky eaters and not slow learners. They eat insects, roots, acorns, small reptiles, bird eggs, crops, and carrion with equal enthusiasm, and they figure out very quickly which areas are dangerous and which are safe. A sounder that has been shot at once will often become almost entirely nocturnal within weeks, making them far harder to track and cull. Their reproductive output is where the real trouble begins. A single sow can reach sexual maturity within her first year of life and can produce 2 litters annually, each containing anywhere from 4 to a dozen piglets. Under decent conditions, a small founding population can multiply into the thousands within just a few years. Wildlife biologists often describe the situation using a simple rule of thumb. Hunters and trappers would need to remove roughly 2/3 of the entire population every single year just to keep numbers flat, let alone reduce them. In practice, most control programs manage to remove less than 1/3, which means the population keeps expanding even as removal efforts intensify. The financial toll of this expansion is enormous. Estimates place nationwide agricultural damage and control costs well over $1 billion annually, a figure that includes ruined crops, collapsed irrigation lines, broken fences, contaminated water sources, and the labor costs of trapping and removal programs. Rice, corn, peanuts, and sorghum fields are particularly vulnerable, since hogs will plow through an entire section overnight searching for buried seed or newly sprouted plants. Cattle ranchers report losses too, since hogs compete for feed, damage pastureland, and in some documented cases have been known to prey on newborn calves and lambs. Beyond agriculture, the ecological cost is just as severe. Their rooting behavior strips topsoil, silts up streams, and destroys the nesting grounds of ground-dwelling birds and reptiles. In wetland and forest ecosystems already under pressure from development, an unchecked hog population can undo years of conservation work in a single season. Given all of that destruction, it would seem logical for the country to simply eat its way out of the problem. Wild boar meat, after all, has a reputation abroad as something closer to a delicacy than a nuisance. The math looks tempting on paper, millions of pounds of free-range, antibiotic-free protein wandering around at no cost to ranchers, just waiting to be harvested. But the reality of turning a wild pest into a regulated food product runs into obstacle after obstacle, starting with biology and ending with bureaucracy. The biological obstacle is disease. Because feral hogs live entirely outside any veterinary oversight, they can carry an unsettling range of pathogens. Researchers have documented dozens of diseases and parasites capable of jumping from wild pigs to humans, livestock, or pets. Brucellosis is among the most concerning, a bacterial infection that can cause chronic fever, joint pain, and fatigue in people who handle infected carcasses without protection. Trichinosis, caused by a parasitic roundworm embedded in muscle tissue, can trigger severe pain and swelling if the meat is undercooked. Hogs can also harbor strains of swine influenza, along with bacteria like Salmonella and E. coli picked up from scavenging in contaminated water or rotting carcasses. None of this makes the meat inherently unsafe to eat, but it does mean that every single animal is an unknown quantity until it has been properly field-dressed, inspected, and cooked to a safe internal temperature. Unlike a hog raised on a licensed farm, there is no health record, no controlled diet, and no way to know what a particular animal has been exposed to over its lifetime. That uncertainty runs headlong into the second obstacle, which is regulatory. In the United States, meat cannot legally enter the commercial food chain unless the animal passes inspection before slaughter, a standard set up specifically to keep sick or contaminated animals out of grocery stores and restaurants. Wild hogs, by definition, are killed in the field, often at a distance, often at night, which makes pre-slaughter inspection essentially impossible under current rules. The handful of facilities licensed to process feral swine for commercial sale are concentrated almost entirely in one state, and even there the animals typically have to be captured alive and held for a period before they can be legally processed and inspected. That live capture requirement alone rules out the vast majority of hogs killed through hunting, trapping with lethal methods, or aerial gunning, which remains one of the most effective tools for population control in areas too dense or remote for ground-based hunting. The result is a strange bottleneck. The animals causing the most damage are usually removed in ways that make their meat legally unsellable, while the few that could theoretically enter the food chain represent a tiny fraction of the total population. Then there is the matter of taste and consistency, which turns out to be a bigger barrier than most people expect. Domestic pork has been bred for generations to produce a predictable product, pale, tender, mild-flavored meat that behaves the same way whether it comes from a farm in Iowa or a farm in North Carolina. Wild hogs offer none of that consistency. Diet varies wildly from region to region and season to season, which directly affects the texture and flavor of the meat. An older boar, especially an uncastrated male, can develop what hunters and processors call taint, a strong, musky odor caused by hormonal compounds that build up in the fat and muscle. Even hogs without taint tend to produce darker, leaner, tougher meat than what most American shoppers are used to, since these animals are constantly moving and burning energy rather than standing in a pen. For a food industry built around uniform products that behave predictably in a kitchen, an animal that can taste completely different from one hog to the next is a difficult thing to market at scale, no matter how flavorful an individual cut might be. Layered on top of the science and the logistics is something harder to quantify: a purely cultural resistance. Ask most Americans what a wild pig looks like and the image that comes to mind is not a rustic, free-range delicacy. It is a filthy, tusked animal rooting through garbage, associated with disease, property destruction, and danger rather than dinner. That mental picture has been reinforced for decades by local news coverage of hog attacks, agricultural damage reports, and public health warnings, all of which paint the animal as a menace to be eliminated rather than a resource to be harvested. Surveys conducted in states with heavy hog populations consistently find that residents view the animals almost exclusively through the lens of pest control. Even hunters who spend entire weekends trapping and shooting hogs to protect their land often have no intention of eating what they kill. The goal is population reduction, not dinner. Compare that to European countries such as Italy, France, and Germany, where wild boar has been hunted and eaten for centuries and carries an almost aristocratic reputation, tied to autumn traditions, regional recipes, and multi-generational hunting culture. In Japan, wild boar hot pot is treated as a beloved seasonal comfort food in mountain regions. In much of Eastern Europe, boar meat shows up at holiday tables in smoked sausages and hearty stews. None of these cultures had to overcome the same cultural baggage that Americans associate with the animal, because in those places, wild boar was never rebranded as vermin to begin with. Layer all of these factors together and the picture becomes clear. It is not one single reason keeping wild boar off American plates, but a combination of interlocking problems reinforcing each other. The disease risk keeps regulators cautious. The regulatory system keeps commercial processing nearly non-existent. The lack of commercial processing keeps the meat scarce and unfamiliar to the average consumer. That unfamiliarity, combined with decades of pest control messaging, keeps public perception firmly rooted in disgust rather than appetite. And the natural inconsistency of the meat itself makes it a hard sell even to consumers willing to give it a try. Each obstacle on its own might be manageable. Stacked together, they have kept a genuinely abundant food source almost entirely off the table for the better part of a century. There are signs that this could slowly shift. A small but growing number of specialty butchers, chefs, and outdoor-focused food brands have started marketing properly processed wild boar as a sustainable, ethical alternative to factory farm pork, leaning into the same appeal that has made other once unusual proteins, from bison to rabbit to venison, gradually more mainstream. Wildlife agencies in several states have also begun exploring partnerships with inspected processing facilities and food banks, aiming to funnel more legally harvested hog meat toward human consumption rather than letting it go to waste in the field. None of this is likely to solve the underlying population crisis on its own, since even a thriving wild boar meat industry would only be able to process a small fraction of the millions of animals currently causing damage. But it does suggest a future where wild boar stops being viewed purely as vermin and starts being treated, at least in some markets, as a legitimate and even desirable food source. Whether that shift ever reaches the scale needed to make a dent in the hog population is an open question, one that depends as much on changing minds as changing regulations. Sushi, octopus, and goat meat were all once considered unusual or unappetizing to the average American consumer, yet each eventually carved out a lasting place in the country's food culture through exposure, marketing, and shifting attitudes toward what counts as good food. Wild boar could plausibly follow a similar path, especially as interest grows in sustainable, free-range, and invasive species-based eating. For now, though, the animal remains caught in an unusual limbo. Too dangerous and too destructive to ignore, yet too tangled in disease risk, bureaucratic red tape, and cultural stigma to end up as dinner. Millions of pounds of meat continue to walk through American fields and forests every year, mostly unclaimed, while the country spends enormous sums trying to get rid of the very animal that much of the world would happily put on a plate. What do you think? Would you try wild boar if it was safely processed and readily available, or does the idea still feel too far removed from what belongs on an American dinner table? Let us know where you stand in the comments. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.